Today's webinar, Bird-Friendly Recommendations for Bottomland Forests in the Carolinas, is made possible through Forestry and Natural Resource Webinars, a partnership with the North Carolina State University Cooperative Extension, Southern Regional Extension Forestry, and the Texas A&M Forest Service. I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Matthew Johnson and Brandon Heitkamp. Matthew is Education Manager at the Audubon Center at Francis Beidler Forest in Harleyville, South Carolina, and Brandon is Resource Manager for Silver Bluff Audubon Center and Sanctuary in Jackson, South Carolina, and I'll turn it over to them.
All right. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to start with our introductory PowerPoint slide here. Thanks for the intro, Sean. And as you said, the title of our presentation today is Bird-Friendly Recommendations for Bottomland Forests in the Carolinas. So the subtitle, Birds and People on Common Ground. And this sort of started a few years ago, and I want to acknowledge the people who at least got this going and who we've sort of piggybacked on here. But our state director in South Carolina, Norman Brunswick, and Curtis Smalling, who works for Audubon in North Carolina, and several other people sort of got together and put this together as part of the Together Green Grant, which is a partnership between Toyota and Audubon. And the idea here was to provide a set of recommendations that would benefit the birds that need it the most, and we're talking about, again, birds in bottomland systems, but could also provide timber revenue for landowners. And so over the last couple years, we've really been targeting landowners and foresters to try to promote this set of recommendations. So I want to acknowledge the work that was done before Brandon and I have really jumped into this. And we're sort of, as I said, piggybacking off of them. And we've also worked with our partners here in South Carolina, namely the Low Country Open Land Trust, which has helped us engage a lot of different landowners, as well as our managers here at Beidler Forest and the company we work with quite a bit in South Carolina, American Forest Management. So sort of an outline for what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about, how we got to this point from Audubon's perspective, and what the priority species are that we're really trying to impact with our recommendations, and a little bit of what are their main habitat requirements. And that'll take us about halfway through the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Brandon, who's our resource manager and forester in South Carolina, and he's going to present sort of the forestry ideas that we have that will impact these birds that I'll be discussing, and then we're going to try to finish it up with some economics if we have time. So that's sort of the idea for today. So if you're wondering, when I mentioned that we're with the Audubon Society, what business does Audubon have? A bird conservation organization talking to you about habitat management. So you might be asking yourselves, why Audubon? And maybe you're asking yourself, well, why now? And so let me try to answer those questions here getting started. Audubon really has a history of bird conservation dating back to the early 1900s. If you know anything about the Audubon Society, there was a big push for plumage, especially the feathers of wading birds and the hats of people at the time. And so these birds were really going, really in decline very drastically. And it was Audubon that really employed the first game wardens. Guy Bradley, if you've ever heard that name, actually lost his life protecting wading birds down in Florida. And since then, we sort of had the history of conservation that's focused a lot on birds. And so, we have this history, and the why now part of this conversation focuses really on Audubon's strategic plan. I've been working with Audubon for about a year, and I came into the organization at a really interesting time, because in 2012 we launched our new strategic plan, and this plan laid out Audubon and its organization and its partners around the Great Bird Flyways. And if you know anything about bird migration, birds sort of group themselves during migration into sort of 4 distinct flyways. And it's not true for every single bird, but it is true sort of in general. And so the map here on your left sort of shows that you have birds that sort of utilize the Pacific coast, this central part, the Central Plains, the Mississippi River, and the Atlantic coast. And as I said, it's not true for every bird, but in general, birds group themselves along these great flyways. And Audubon has organized themselves in a similar way. And so, instead of thinking just at the state level, for instance, for us here in South Carolina, we're now thinking and collaborating not only internally in Audubon, but with our partners and chapters all along the Atlantic coast. And it makes sense because, birds don't operate at the state level. A lot of birds travel nationally, internationally, and we need to be thinking broader in terms of how we effectively, manage and conserve birds and their habitat. So, zooming over to the Atlantic coast, there are multiple strategies that we've utilized in the Atlantic coast or in the Atlantic flyway to impact the birds of greatest conservation concern. And we've done that through several different priority projects. And we have projects that are, they're dealing with birds that utilize seashores and seabirds. We have projects that are targeting birds that like grasslands and shrublands, and projects that target birds that are being impacted by the effects of climate change. But the project that is most relevant to what we're going to be talking about today has to do with identifying, protecting, and managing large forest blocks. And what you see in the map on the left here, particularly in green, are areas that we've identified on the Atlantic coast where we feel like we can have a real impact on large forest blocks. And so, we're actively working with our Audubon colleagues all along the Atlantic coast to identify these areas and also talk with foresters and landowners about how they can effectively manage the birds that utilize these habitats. And these, the bulk of these birds are what we would call interior forest breeding birds. They need large tracts of contiguous forest in order to successfully survive and reproduce. And so it's really trying to manage these lands effectively with those birds in mind. So we zoom in from the Atlantic coast now to South Carolina. You'll see the priority forest blocks in green that were just on that larger map. And also in these sort of pinkish purple circles are the specific areas where we've targeted most of our efforts in South Carolina. And it's not as though we think that those are the only areas that need work. That's not the case at all, but really it's because there are areas along river systems where there's abundant bottomland forest, and also areas where we have Audubon assets. So on that leftmost circle, in the upper part of that circle, you can see that that small patch of red is the Silver Bluff Audubon Center, and so we've been working in that area, especially along the Savannah River, to target the bottomland forest birds in that area. Right of that, the circle in the bottom right encompasses that sort of semicircle of red, which is Byler Forest. That's where Brandon and I are talking with you from today, where we own and manage about 15,000 acres of bottomland, and we're in the Four-Hole Swamp watershed here, which flows into the Edisto River. And if you know anything about coastal South Carolina, the Edisto River makes up part of the Ace Basin, one of the largest estuarine systems anywhere in the country. And then lastly, that top, smallest circle is the Kawasi Basin, with an abundant amount of bottomland where we actually own land now from Audubon, as an Audubon, under Audubon ownership. And that Kawasi is an acronym for the confluence of the Congaree, the Wateree, and the Santee rivers. So we've targeted these areas because these are areas we feel like we can effectively work, but not the only areas with important bottomland forests. And so the other question you might be wondering is, why we as Audubon feel like, we have anything to say about bottomland forests. And to me, the easiest way to answer that is through explaining what we call the Byler model. And in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when Audubon acquired this property here in Four-Hole Swamp, it was just a little patch of green, which you see in the top part of this map on the left. That was 3,400 acres then, and that also included 1,800 acres of original growth cypress tupelo swamp. And if you've been to our visitor center or walked our boardwalk, that was what you walked through. Well, down on the map, in the bottom part of this map, you'll see that original patch of green, but also this sort of, much bigger patches of of pinkish green or pinkish purple, that's what we own today, and that encompasses about 17,000 acres total that's under Audubon ownership. And we've done this through fee simple purchases and through mitigation, and we've acquired the land and manage it now as bottomland forest, and this includes a lot of swamp that flows through this four-hole swamp watershed. And in addition to that, what you see in sort of the grayish brown blobs are conservation easements, where we've worked with landowners and partners in the area who didn't want necessarily to sell their land but wanted to see it remain forested and remain protected, and so we've worked with them to establish conservation easements on their land. So an additional 18,000 acres that's been protected in the area. So over 40 years, we feel like we've been able to learn how these bottomland systems work. We know that they're great bird habitat, and I'll talk about some of those birds in just a little bit. They're not as intensively managed from a forestry perspective, which we'll talk more about when I turn over to Brandon. And then lastly, we found that landowners needed something more. And what I mean by that was that as Norman and members of the Low Country Open Land Trust started to approach landowners about easements, their main advice was, you can do some management on the pine in the areas where you have pines, but we're just going to leave the bottomlands alone. And while they were interested in an easement and interested in what we had to say, they couldn't afford not to harvest anything in the bottomlands. And so they sort of said, do you have anything else that might allow us to harvest a little bit of wood in the bottomlands and do what's right for the birds, but also allow us to make a little revenue? And we didn't at the time, and that's where this, these recommendations have kind of come from. So what we've identified is 13 focused bird species that we're hoping to impact by our bottomland forest recommendations, and we call these the Bottomland Baker's Dozen. And we didn't pick these because we think they're the prettiest, although a lot of them are really pretty, but because they're a conglomerate of about, they're ones that we've picked out of about 30 to 35 species that really utilize and breed in bottomland forests that are of the highest conservation concern. And so I'm going to go through some of these. But there's 13 focused species, and we are required to ask you a couple questions today. So the first one is, we'll see how many of you are paying attention. How many focused species are we trying to impact with our bird-friendly bottomland forest recommendations? And I think you can use the same way to log in or to answer, and it looks like most of you are paying attention. Oh, there's one D. D is not right. So yeah, so 13 species of the Bottomland Baker's Dozen is what we're trying to impact here, and good job to those of you who got that right. So I said we didn't pick these birds because we thought that they were the coolest, even though a lot of them are cool. We picked them because of their a lot of them have declining populations or their high conservation value. And so I'm going to go through some of these birds and just introduce them to you, because for those of you that spend a lot of time in bottomland forests, you probably see these birds, and if you don't see them, you may hear them and not know what they are. So as we go along here, if you see these emblems on the left, what you'll notice that they show up under a bird's name. And so if you see the emblem from South Carolina, for example, it goes on South Carolina's State Wildlife Action Plan. Same thing for North Carolina. If you see the little circle there, that's a bird that's on the Partners in Flight Conservation Plan. Partners in Flight is probably one of the biggest working groups focusing on bird conservation in the world. Same thing for the emblem for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service list of birds of conservation concern, and then the Audubon logo for birds that are on Audubon and the American Bird Conservancy's watch list. And then lastly, on the right here is this little ribbon. And if you see this red ribbon under a bird's name, it's what we refer to as a responsibility species. And what a responsibility species is a bird who has at least 5% of its global population breeding in an area. And in this case, we're looking at North and South Carolina. And so the percentage you see is going to be the combined percentage for both states. And the idea behind this responsibility species is that while it may be a locally common species, it may be globally rare, and therefore the areas where they are abundant are responsible for keeping these birds abundant. And so we sort of consider ourselves responsible for them. So moving into introducing some of these birds, I could just go down the list of each one and talk about them, but to me that's, that can get kind of boring and monotonous, and I want to avoid that. So what we did was we worked with one of our educators here at Byler, who's a good graphic artist, and he, we wanted him to portray just a cross section of a bottomland forest, and we made this, sort of the way we wanted it, so that on the left-hand end, it's a little wetter. That's where you're seeing a lot of cypress and tupelo, and species that are going to utilize that more. And then you move slightly up slope from left to right, subtle changes in elevation, at least in a lot of bottomland systems, and the habitat changes a little bit. And then on the far right end, what we did was we threw in a little disturbance. So this would be in an area where a few of the canopy trees have been taken out for one reason or another, and that could have been artificially done or done through a natural disturbance such as a lightning strike or small fire or hurricane or a tornado or something along those lines. And you're going to see how those sort of match our recommendations a little bit later. So we did that on purpose. And the reason I wanted to do this is because oftentimes we see birds partition themselves within bottomland systems based on the habitat they prefer, their foraging behavior, what they like to eat, all sorts of these different things. So we're going to start over at the left-hand end, which will be sort of the wetter end of this. And the first three birds that I want to introduce, prothonotary warbler, yellow-throated warbler, and the Acadian flycatcher. And I'm going to go through each of these individually quickly, but again, this is sort of on the wetter end of a bottomland system where you do have standing water, you do have a lot of cypress and tupelo, you have some snags in there as well. And the prothonotary warbler is the first species I'll mention. These birds have been referred to as the canary of the swamp, or the golden swamp warbler. Their name now is a lot harder to pronounce, but that word prothonotary is from a British word, prothonotary, which referred to these clerks that used to work in the papal court that wore these bright yellow robes. There's a little prothonotary warbler trivia for you. But a bright yellow bird, low to the ground, and they nest usually over water. They're our only eastern cavity nesting warbler. And on these range maps that we're showing you, these maps are from the USGS Gap Analysis Project. And I mentioned Curtis earlier, and he utilized these maps, and I thought that, and I kept them because I thought they worked really well, because they show the known range of the bird, which is outlined in blue, and everything you see sort of in tan is its summer range. So that's where we know that they breed or have known to bred. And this bird, like many of the ones we're going to talk about, are neotropical migrants. So they spend their summers here breeding and making baby birds, and they spend their winters in the tropics. This one in particular utilizes mangrove forests in Central and South America. And then what you see sort of in greenish brown is this bird's predicted habitat, the area where you would think that they are most likely to be based on their habitat preferences. And for instance, this bird really likes to nest over standing water. So the prothonotary warbler is a responsibility species for us in the Carolinas. Over 20% of the global population of this bird breed in North and South Carolina. So locally common in our area, which is why it's not on either of the state wildlife action plans, but on the all three of the federal plans that I listed, both for Partners in Flight, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and for Audubon. Other warbler on our list, and one that you may be less likely to see and more likely to hear, is a yellow-throated warbler. As the name implies, a bright yellow throat. You usually get a look at them just like this, looking down from you from above. They like wet areas, but usually much higher in the canopy, and will build their nests in the tops of cypress trees, a lot of times around Spanish moss, at least in our area. Another bird that's a responsibility species for us, with about 17% of their population nesting in the Carolinas, and again a bird that shows up on the Partners in Flight conservation plan. And the only flycatcher on the list, a bird that's easy to pick out if you're walking through an area that has a lot of Acadian flycatchers because of their loud two-parted call. I'm our education director here at Byler Forest, and we get I take a lot of school kids out on our boardwalk, and I always tell them that the bird sounds like it's saying what I want to have for lunch, which is pizza. Pizza. It's a two-parted, real high-pitched call that if you heard that and thought about it, you would probably remember that. But another bird that's a responsibility species for us, and here in South Carolina, a species that shows up on our wildlife action plan, usually sits sort of middle of the canopy, and like a lot of flycatchers do, sit and will wait for an insect to pass by, fly out, catch it, and a lot of times return to the exact same perch. So the three in the wettest area I just mentioned, and now we sort of moved, and this sort of worked.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Just a moment, everyone.
All right. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes, we got you. We lost you at the beginning of this slide. If you'd start over, please.
Sure. Sorry about that. So we sort of moved from the wetter area. If you remember that first initial graphic, we moved from the wetter areas up the slope just a little bit, and again, subtle changes in elevation, but more developed subcanopy and shrub layer. You start to see things like, at least in our area, we start to see things like ivy or holly, ironwood, some dwarf palmetto, and trees that have transitioning from cypress and tupelo to oaks and elms and ashes and things of that nature. And the birds that are utilize these areas a little bit more be the only woodpecker on our list, the red-bellied woodpecker, the yellow-billed cuckoo, and the hooded warbler. The red-bellied woodpecker is an interesting one that we kept on our list for two specific reasons. One, it fits into one of our best management practices that we suggest alongside these recommendations, which is to leave snags, to leave standing dead trees. Often, those trees get cut down, but they're a great roosting and nesting spot for woodpeckers, particularly ones like the red-bellied woodpecker. But if you've done any bird watching, you probably know that a red-bellied is a really common woodpecker. They show up at bird feeders. A lot of people have them in their backyards, but they do tend to nest in bottomland areas. And they are a really common bird, but if you look at their range map, they are restricted to the southeastern United States. So while they're not a responsibility species for the Carolinas, geographically their range is pretty narrow. And so the reason that it's on the Partners in Flight conservation list, as you see by the little round icon there, and on our list, is because not only do we want to impact those birds of highest conservation concern, but we want to do so while keeping common birds common. And a red-bellied woodpecker is a good model that sort of explains that. The next bird is the cuckoo, the yellow-billed cuckoo, the most common cuckoo we have in our area. Only on North Carolina's action plan, but a common bird in bottomlands, one that sort of hangs out in the middle of the canopy. They eat almost exclusively caterpillars, and if you've heard of this bird, you may have heard of it referred to as the rain crow. I've had foresters tell me that if you hear this bird call and you have 30 minutes to get out of the woods before it starts raining. It's a myth as far as I know, but I've heard them calling plenty of times when it didn't look like it was about to rain. But a bigger graceful bird that does inhabit sort of the mid canopy of these bottomland systems and can be pretty secretive. A lot of times, more often seen than heard. And then our third woodpecker is the hooded woodpecker. Third warbler rather, sorry, is a hooded warbler, named for that really pretty black hood surrounding its yellow face. And this is a bird that tends to make use of the more developed shrub layer in these little bit higher, less wet areas of bottomlands. A bird that can be pretty secretive to see, but is a responsibility species for us in the Carolinas here and on North Carolina's State Wildlife Action Plan. Okay, so moving again from left to right and to our the highest, most upland part of the bottomland systems, and these are going to be the birds sort of that drive our recommendations today. The last two warblers and the only raptor on our list, which is the swallowtail kite. And again, just as I mentioned earlier, we threw sort of a disturbance in here, which could be a natural disturbance or a man-made disturbance where the canopy is a little more open and it's allowed for almost a thicket to form. In the understory and in the shrub layer, these would be things a lot of times like switch cane, but also brambles and briars, greenbrier, things like that that'll often come in response to an increased amount of light that's hitting the forest floor. So that's the regeneration that we're showing here in this graphic and that we're going to be going for on our recommendations that you'll hear about in just a little bit. So the Kentucky warbler, just like the Swainson's warbler and the swallowtail kite is on just about every state and federal list. One of our rare warblers that really likes to use the thicker areas, another one more often seen than heard. Not a responsibility species for us in the Carolinas, but again, a bird that's state and federally listed and in decline. Swallowtail kite, as I mentioned, the only raptor. And you can see its range map a lot different from the other species on our list. And this is a raptor that does migrate into Central and South America. In fact, a large portion of this bird's I'm seeing that I'm cutting in and out. I hope the bulk of you can hear me. I'm going to continue on. Okay, good, thanks. But where a lot of this species population is in South America and are now starting to breed in bottomland forest in the Carolinas, and these birds like super emergent trees to build their nests, and they often will feed on the wings over bottomland systems and over surrounding agricultural areas. These birds are what I call the epitome of fast food. They catch dragonflies, and sometimes they can pick small lizards and snakes off the treetops, and they eat on the wing. They're eating as they fly. If you ever get a good look at one, it's a pretty incredible thing to see. But you can also see a bird that is on both of our wildlife action plans in the Carolinas, and one that we're particularly interested in here at Byler Forest because we've seen them around. We've seen them carrying nesting material. We've seen young birds, but we haven't found a nest yet. A bird whose nest can be hard to find, but if you ever get a good look at one swooping low over you, it's a pretty remarkable bird and one that's sort of hard to forget. And then the last bird I'm going to mention, the Swainson's warbler, is probably one of the most imperiled songbirds in the southeastern United States or in the United States in general. A bird that drives a lot of our conservation concern. These are birds that like to live low to the ground. They want a really dense shrub layer, and they want very little sunlight to actually hit the forest floor. But they want to be in the upper parts of bottomlands where there's almost floods very, very, very rarely, or just once or twice a year, and there's flippable ground litter. These birds are actually ground nesting birds that are found on the ground, or that nest on the ground, are found on the ground where they flip over leaves in search of spiders and things like that. And their habitat is, as I was saying earlier, is a thicket type habitat. One researcher described Swainson's warbler habitat as if you need a machete to get through it in order to find where these birds are hanging out and nesting. But you can see from the icons there a bird that's on every state and federal list, and one that, as I said, is really driving a lot of our recommendations today. So again, going back to this graphic, one thing I really want to point out is that it's not, this isn't a surefire thing. These are the types of places that those birds I just went through like to live, but it's not as though you can't see a prothonotary warbler away from water, or you won't see a hooded warbler down near the swamp. These birds are moving around, are dynamic, but in terms of where they prefer to nest and where they prefer to spend most of their time, that's sort of a general overview of the birds that we're trying to impact through the recommendations that you'll see today. So when Brandon's talking about small patch clear cuts, he's going to be talking about with the idea of trying to create habitat for Swainson's warblers and Kentucky warblers and some of these other birds that really like these canopy gaps that allow some regeneration at the ground level and at the shrub level. Okay, so that takes us through sort of the background, the priority birds, and also it does take us through the habitat requirements. That's not crossed out. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Heitkamp, who's the resource manager and our forester at Silver Bluff Audubon Center, who's going to go through some of our forestry recommendations, and if we have some time, he'll go through some of these economics as well.
That's my ugly mug in the picture there, holding a savanna sparrow that we did mist netting. Good to talk to you all today. We're going to shift from bird identification towards forest management a little bit, and this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, because what we really want to do is build as much bird habitat as we can. So how do foresters get involved in making bird habitat? I think the big point is that we need to mimic what would naturally have happened. A lot of these birds would need, disturbances of some sort. So leaving it alone isn't always the only answer. So our typical hardwood management in the southeast has been either large clear cuts or leave it as is. So more than likely, if you did hardwood clear cutting, you'd do a 40 or a 60 acre block or bigger all at once, which makes good habitat, early successional habitat for some species, but kind of neglects others. And then the same or reverse could be said. If you left everything as is, you'd never have any of the early successional habitat that some of these birds need. And you'd be doing a really good job with the birds that need mature climax forest. So today we want to talk a little bit about some other options that we could do. This is Silver Bluff Audubon Sanctuary, a cut that we finished about 4 months ago. And this is a 90-acre hardwood island. And on that 90 acres, there are 9 acres of small patch clear cuts, a 5-acre, a 3-acre, and a 1-acre, which you can see is 10% of the bottomland area in a regenerative state. So we like to suggest 2 to 10 acre openings, which can be economical. We'll talk about that. And no more than 10% of the forest being in early successional habitat. This picture is looking across the clear cut, and we've not had a huge response yet. It doesn't immediately become Swainson's habitat, but in just a couple of years it will be thick enough that it is hard to walk through. You need a machete, and you will have the response that you want while keeping 90% of the forest in forest interior, which we'll talk more about as well. These are some of the birds that we're trying to hit with this. I won't go back through them all. The hooded warblers on the bottom left and Swainson on the bottom right, 2 that particularly need to be in the clear cut that we didn't have before. So let's see if you're paying attention so far, and I see there's some questions popping up. We'll talk about questions at some point, but we're going to go through the material first. So what size do we recommend for small patch clear cuts? Go ahead and put your answers in. Give you a moment to do that. I see some people writing it. Remember that you use the icon under your name to punch it in. It looks like almost everybody's gotten it right so far. So, thanks very much. So one of the ways we set these things up, we tried to figure out if you're not going to have a 40-acre or a 60-acre square clear cut, how are you going to get multiple clear cuts where they make sense from a logging standpoint? And one of our ideas was string of pearls, where you have a centralized road or drag system with clear cuts along that system. Each can have its own logging deck, or if they're small, you can drag from one to the other. We use this some on our place. Works quite well. You can also do spokes of a wheel or linear progressions. It's an art form. You can set it up however your terrain, however your road system deems it best to do so. So here's our example. This is the on-the-ground example that we finished up this last year. On our sanctuary at Silver Bluff, there is a 90-acre stand. It was blown down in the 80s and was literally only 25 years old. Homogeneous, The entire thing acted as canopy closure. We called it 95% canopy closure. Now I see a couple people that would probably balk at that being called mature forest, being only 25 years old. But when we say mature forest in this situation, what we mean is to a bird. To a bird, structurally, this 25-year-old stand was closed canopy forest that they used very little light on the ground, not a lot of understory, and so to them it was mature as far as structure goes. We had two options that we looked at, both being regenerating 10% of the stand using patch cuts, but it depended on the 15-year entry cycle, how often you wanted to come in. If you literally were going to cut everything on a 10% by 15 year, you're talking 135-year rotation. We decided that we would leave 45 acres on the east side of the island completely alone outside of occasional thinnings and let them convert to old growth, assuming we don't have another act of nature to blow them down. So that gives us a 15-year entry cycle, meaning every 15 years we start to run out of early successional habitat. We need to go back in and make new, and we have a 75-year rotation, which allows for pretty big trees to be grown in the area. So we chose option 2, and we did 75 acres of thinning to let some light on the ground so that we could start to have an understory develop. You can see how big our trees are after only 25 years. We had a lot of saw timber, typically in our ash and sycamore as our species. We have 3 small patch clear cuts, 1, 3, and 5 acres for a total of 9 acres, which is 10% of our island, just right along with our recommendations. And these are 2 pictures of what they look like. The clear cut, I think that's the bigger one on the right, and the thinning, an example of it on the left. We wanted to talk a little bit about feathering the edges of your small patch openings. So this is a graphic that we put together to kind of talk a little bit about that. When you have a hard edge, we have a bit of a problem with our brown-headed cowbirds, which is this job right here. Their preferred habitat is open agricultural and grassland areas, but they're pretty prolific, and what they do is they search the edges to find nests of other species, and as you can see, in the middle picture there's a bigger egg. It's blue with dark mottling on it. That is what they do. They come in and the female will lay an egg in someone else's nest and then leave, and they're basically a nest parasite. So if you look on the bottom right, you'll see a warbler next to a brown-headed cowbird. Common yellow-throated warbler. Sorry, I'm the forester in the group. And what you'll see is, look how much bigger the brown-headed cowbird is than the warbler. So when Mama is coming back trying to feed her 5 eggs, her 5 little chicks, she's also having to feed this monster. So if you look in the bottom left, I believe those are bluebirds, aren't they, Matt, in that nest? I think so, yeah. Bluebird nest, and you'll see several bluebirds in there with a brown-headed cowbird that's about 3 times as big. So what we're trying to do by feathering the edges is the interior birds will go further into the forest to set up their nests, and therefore they're less likely to be parasitized by these brown-headed cowbirds because they can lay as many as 40 eggs in a season, and they can be a problem. So these feathered edges come in like that. It happens naturally when you thin the woods. If you're not doing a thinning alongside of your recommendations, then you might want to think harder about your feathered edges. So question 3. Use your buttons and answer me. Feathered edges and small openings are 2 ways to reduce the impact of this parasitic bird. Y'all are faster now. I'm digging it. Good job. Wonderful. All right, moving on. So Matt earlier talked about when we put this sunlight on the ground, we make this disturbance in our I wouldn't call them high areas, but our drier areas and our hardwood areas. You're going to get this machete habitat, this thicket that's hard to walk through. And this is an example, a photo that we've taken of a thicket, and there's another one right here that's more of the switch cane thicket. And you can see it would be hard to walk through either one of them without pushing things out of the way, hacking things out of the way with a machete, and that is exactly what we want. These hooded warblers and Swainson warblers, they want it thick like that, where you might hear them, but they're going to be hard to see. And the great thing about this is that we're already starting to have this regeneration at Silver Bluff, where we just cut this last year. Does this have the thing to click it? No, it doesn't. Apologize. This is cane starting to come up, grasses and cane. We're also going to have a large amount of hardwood stems per acre, which help develop that thicket. And this is only after a couple months. So we feel like at this rate, you know, at 2 years past harvest, we're going to have a pretty good thick spot that's hard to walk through, and we're going to start to have these birds in these areas where we didn't have them. So the question that got us to the 2 to 10 acre compromise is clear-cut size, what's right? And the question would be, what's right for a landowner and what's right for a bird? So a lot of these birds can function on a little half-acre opening. They don't need a 10-acre opening. And a landowner, if it's trying to make money, would love to have a 30-acre or larger clear-cut. So what we tried to do is we found that there's a little sweet spot in the middle, 2 to 10 acre clear-cuts, and as many as you need to get to your 10%. It kind of was the sweet spot in the middle where we're taking care of the birds' needs, but we're not neglecting the landowner's desire to make some money and make this a viable thing economically. We also talked that we did some hardwood thinning, and we did it a little different than you would think. It's not your typical thinning that you think of when you go up the uplands and thin your pines. We're not doing rows or basilary at all. What we're using is canopy closure because, again, we're thinking like a bird. So our mark that we wanted to hit was we did not want to bring the canopy closure down below 60 to 70%. So that means when you looked up, we still wanted to have 60 to 70% of the canopy there so that that forest acted like a closed canopy, mature forest to a bird. Tree selection is where the forester's mind comes in. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to make your landowner more money now? Are you trying to get rid of certain species and leave the better trees for later? In our situation, we left a lot of ash. We got rid of a lot of hackberry, and we tried to make decisions where later on, since our forest was only 25 years old, we left the better stuff so that further on down the line, if we come in and thin again, or if our clear cuts move, our small patch cuts move, we would have higher quality things to sell and therefore at a later date make more money. That being said, our sale was economically viable for sure. So what we did, we're going to talk a little bit about the 60 to 70% canopy closure because I know it's probably a foreign idea, but real quick, question 4, what is the minimum target canopy closure for our thinning recommendation? Set you up a little bit on that one. And as expected, y'all are doing wonderfully. Very good. All right, good job. This is 95% canopy closure. So what am I looking at? I'm looking up. If I walked out there and looked straight up, and each of these different shades of green was a different tree. So picture that as a canopy. When you look up, when we had not done anything out there, this is what you saw. You saw just a little bit of light coming through. Everything's grown together, very little sunlight on the ground. We call that 95% canopy closure. And this is more like 60% canopy closure, which is what we were going for. I think there's 2 slides to show you. And you can see some of the trees are missing now. And here's another example. What we wanted to do when we go out there is when you look up, we wanted to see sun. We wanted to see the light coming through. These trees are going to have a response. They're going to get bigger. They're going to fill the gaps. And before you know it, you'll have to do this again. The nice thing about these thinnings is they make the smaller clear cuts quite viable economically because you get to cut more than just the small acreage. So this is what ours looks like. If you go out and look at it after our marking, I marked the property looking up, had a very sore neck. I'm kidding. It wasn't bad at all, but you get a good feel for it. And this is this is probably 100 yards away from one of the clear cuts, looking up through the treetops, and you can see a lot more sun. I should have put in we'll have to go back and try to find a slide looking up before when it was 95%, but it looks very similar to the graphic where we're trying to get 60 to 7% of the light coming through. And you can imagine this is 1 year out. These trees are going to respond and fill these gaps quite quickly, become more vigorous, grow quicker, and make us more product out there and more habitat. So one of the things that we did want to discuss, when you thin in hardwoods, people kind of knee-jerk and think about epicormic branching, which is a problem that can occur when too much sunlight is allowed into a stand. We agree that especially on the edges of the clear cut, which is where this picture was taken, it is a problem. But we have found that in the thinning area, when you only take out 40% of the crown, there's really not enough sunlight at any given one time in the forest to make this a big problem. Certainly not to the point of degrading your wood quality. Some species are more prone to this. Your maple is going to sprout with sunlight a lot faster than, say, sycamore would. So you can also consider that when you're deciding which trees to take and which trees to leave. And of course, where you are in the country will help determine that with markets and what things are worth as well. So where are we going to put these openings? We've talked about mimicking Mother Nature, but we also want to consider invasive species. If you have an area that's very thick and privet, why would you pick that as your opening? Because it's going to have a big response when it gets sunlight, correct? And then you might have to do some invasive species management. So these are things to think about. On Silver Bluffs Island project, we are going to have some privet around, and we're going to have to do some chemical work to make sure the stuff that comes back is what we want. And that was a place where we had a small component of that everywhere, and so it was just if you're going to make an opening, probably something we have to deal with. Ours is not a drastic problem, but something to be concerned about. So our typical, without human involvement, the small patch disturbances would look more like tornado damage, right? This is a picture of some tornado damage that we had. It can look like hurricane damage. You see that it's very similar to what we're doing. The hurricane has obviously a little bit more snags left, which is one of the reasons we told you that we'd like you to leave snags, dead trees that are there. If you have none, you might even make some snags, but that's a conversation for another day. In 1989, when this place I had a tornado on it, it blew almost everything flat. And so we had very little late succession, very little closed canopy, and what we had a lot of was Swainson's warbler. They have moved on, and we don't have them right now because there is no habitat for them, but we know that on this exact island, when it was cut flat by a natural disturbance, a tornado, that it was a wonderful Swainson's habitat. And what we're trying to do now is keep all of the birds that we had on there when it was a closed canopy forest while getting our Kentuckys and our Swainsons back on the property. So we're trying to have the best of both worlds, and so far having pretty good luck. So this is a picture where, before we clear cut, this was an ideal Silver Bluff location. Everything was the same height above the river, and so we didn't have a lot of variance in as far as flippable ground litter or flooded areas. It's all kind of the same. So we kind of picked these areas with palmetto and some of our indicator species, which are listed on the bottom left of this, which is another picture of an ideal place, in Four Hole Swamp on Francis Beidler, where Matt and I are talking to you from today. Well, you'll see a list there: ironwood, sweet gum, palmetto, loblolly pine, water and swamp chestnut oaks, green ash, American elm, hawthorn, switch cane, persimmon. These are all species that are indicators of what you want when you're going to pick where to put your small patch disturbance. When we have these indicator species, it's the right kind of wet, it's the right kind of dry, it's what's going to have the response to get that thicket that you want, so that we can make the habitat we're desiring. We've talked a little bit about flippable ground litter. If you pick an area for your opening that is too wet, then a lot of these will be mired in mud and mucked up. So what we have is, by picking our indicator species, it puts us in an area where we have this flippable ground litter, where it's dry enough for these birds to come in and insect in the understory. They flip around and flip things up and look for bugs and eat. Not to say these areas can't flood, but they don't flood as often as the very bottom of the bottomlands, and this is typically where we want to put our small patch disturbances. Vertical diversity, something we had very little of on our island because it was only 25 years old. You can read this definition if you'd like, but the picture is a good description of what kind of stuff that you want to see. You want to see green at lots of different levels. You want to see understory, midstory, and overstory, and that's part of our thinning. When you go in and thin, we don't take all the overstory out, but we open it up and we try to get some understory started. If you have midstory trees and not very many, you don't want to run them over. You want to keep them because there's birds that use all different levels of the forest. And over the years of thinning, we hope that we can develop this and have good vertical diversity out there. It's something that you should be concerned about, especially in the thinning areas. In the small patch disturbance, it's kind of a moot point. So understory and midstory structure, look at these photographs. You can see the bottom one doesn't have a lot going on in the understory, and the other two are much more developed as far as structure. So just some visual help to let you think and look at what things are going to look like when you get sun on the ground and what things look like when you don't have enough sun on the ground. The bottom picture was taken when some of the leaves were off the trees. It's a little thicker than that in the middle of the summer. So the forestry summary is there's some take-home points. And the main take-home points we wanted you to get is in order to maintain your closed canopy forest interior birds and get your early successional birds, we had some points, some things we needed to hit. One is we don't want more than 10% of the entire bottomland in a regenerative state. So you don't want big clear cuts. You're wanting 2 to 10 acre clear cuts and a total of only 10%. If you remember our example, we had a 90 acre island and it was 9 acres. It was in early successional at this point. Feathered edges necessary if thinning does not accompany the clearing. Thinning may be necessary to satisfy the landowner or logger, and if so, shoot for 60 to 70% canopy closure. You do not have to thin to make this habitat. You have closed canopy to start with, then you don't have to do it at all. We did it for species composition to try to get some of the species out that we didn't want, and also to help make it a merchantable stand sale, because 9 acres of clear cut that it was marginal about standing alone. It would not be if they were 60 years old, but at 25 it was marginal. So our thinning significantly helped entice the logger to come in and do the type of management we want. And then the last thing is tree selection can be done to lead better species composition, whether it be for wildlife exclusively, being mass production, or if you're concerned about logs down the road, you check and try to leave all of your better species for economics. Here's your question 5. Total percentage of a given stand that is in a regenerative state should be blank % or less under these recommendations. Use your button there and fill it in for me if you would. And I know I've noticed some questions going on. We'll be happy to answer questions at the end. We're at close to an hour, Sean. I have economics if you'd want me to go through it. I don't know how long people want to stay. Can you chime in on that?
On that note, I'm going to go ahead and push out our post-webinar quiz for anyone that might be interested in CEUs, and I think this will actually be a pretty good spot to end. So I'll push that quiz out and we'll start answering questions.
Wonderful. All right, well, I'll field any questions I see from the room as best we can.
All right, and just a moment, you should have a window browser pop up. If not, I'll also be posting the link to the quiz in the chat box. So just hold on for 1 second. All right, and while that's loading, we'll go through the questions just in the order that I received them. So first one here. Appears that birds are opportunists that are to seek habitats that are beneficial to their needs. In lots of ways, they're similar to what humans do. Do you agree?
Similar to what?
Humans.
I mean, yeah, I would say that's a good way to think about it. I mean, they do the same things that we do. I mean, they need to take in nutrients and water and survive and reproduce. It's sort of the same things we're doing, and it's just about finding the habitats that are right for them. And if you've done any research on birds and the history of these types of habitats in the southeastern United States, you know that a lot of historically of what they used to use is no longer in the same forested state. I mean, we've lost what 80% or so of our bottomland forests. So that's why a lot of these birds are in decline, and why we feel like we need to present some recommendations that can mimic these birds. So I think that is a good way to think about it.
Do either of you have any thoughts on agroforestry approaches to bird habitats? I realize it's a little open-ended.
Not that I'd like to discuss right now.
All right. Any thoughts on silvicultural approaches for birds?
That's a whole nother.
Oh, yeah.
That's a whole nother ball of wax.
Next question. Any thoughts on silvicultural approaches for bird habitat?
I think we covered some probably after we got to that question.
Yeah.
Our main two in southern bottomland forests we went over pretty heavily. There's some nuance and some other things, and if anybody was real interested, they could contact us at either of the Audubon sanctuaries in South Carolina. Pretty easy to find on Google or any search engine, and I'd be happy to talk to them. There's a lot of nuance and kind of art to it when you start getting down. You know, if you want to start managing for oak or whatever species, there's a lot more to it, but not something we can go through today.
Okay, moving on. I read somewhere that the recommendations for songbirds in the forest is a 300-foot buffer. Is this realistic?
A 300-foot buffer on a river or a water system? Is the person still around to clarify?
I think somebody's typing now.
Yeah.
To clarify, from habitation?
From people, dwellings and stuff. I'm going to let, you said 300 feet?
Yes.
Is that what he asked?
Is it realistic?
It's definitely realistic on our place because we've got 3,300 acres. But I guess it would depend on where you're working. I would say that any habitat you can build is probably going to get used by birds.
Yeah, and I would think it would depend. I mean, you know, by habitation you mean a huge, you know, a farm with a huge agricultural area. You know, you may want to really try to shoot for at least 300 feet. If you're talking about sort of from a house, then you know, less than that might be okay.
All right, moving along then. So how many birds prefer 70 to 100% canopy closure, and how do you balance so you don't manage against them?
So the birds that we're shooting, you know, that prefer the closed canopy, are going to be those birds that were sort of at the you know, the wetter, more interior parts when we were presenting there. So things like prothonotary warbler, Acadian flycatcher, yellow-throated warbler. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and answer another question I know somebody had that I read, and it's going to be answered there too. Somebody asked if we left out a couple birds, and you're right, we did. I only went through 9 of our 13, just you know, sort of on purpose, so that, you know, to avoid having, you know, kind of keep things going and not have to talk about every single one, there were a couple other warblers and a species of vireo that we left out that tend to like sort of the middle parts and wetter parts in there. I did that on purpose. If you want any information about the specifics of those birds, I can give it to you. But I did leave those out on purpose. But it's going to be those birds on the wetter end of things that like a more closed canopy, and then the ones on the towards the outer edge there where he was talking about. The outer edge there were the things like the Swainsons and the Kentuckys and things like that. But
to answer the quick question, they asked if more closure than 70% excluded some birds. Our research showed that when we only thinned to 60 to 70% crown closure, we didn't lose any of those forest interior birds. They considered 60 to 70% crown closure as crown closure. And when you got below that, you started to lose them. You'd lose your red-eyed vireos and all your common forest interior birds that we wanted to keep. So that number wasn't drawn just because it sounded like a good number, but literally we could thin to that amount and not lose our forest interior birds. So there's not a huge suite of species that needs 80% crown closure and above. The kind of threshold we found through the research that was done was 60 to 70% is suitable and to still act as closed canopy forest.
And again, to add on that and to answer one other question, we found we did some pre-harvest surveys at the island that Brandon described at Silver Bluff for the birds that are there. We utilize point counts, which is probably the most accepted way for monitoring bird populations. And after the cut, now obviously we want to measure the response of those birds pre and post harvest. And although we've only had, as Brandon said, about 4 months since that harvest, we are actually still already starting to hear and see some of those interior forest nesting birds in the area, in that thinning that was done. So it's only we've only had 4 surveys since the harvest. We're doing them monthly. But we already have seen, at least I can say anecdotally, that we are seeing many of those interior forest nesting birds in the the recent thinning.